Hello, company, and welcome back to the Show People podcast, the podcast that shines a spotlight on the UK performing arts industry and those dedicated to their craft. My name is Andrew Keates. I'm a director, artistic director, and your host. Please welcome back to the stage for part 2, Sir Stephen Fry.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Welcome.
Oh, it's a much nicer and better looking audience than show one.
I thought that. Lovely. Let's get a little bit current. You have just finished the most extraordinary body of work. And I'll allow you to talk about what you decided to undertake for those who don't follow your incredible...
Well, about 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Mythos, which was about the beginning of the Greek myths, about the creation of the world and the first gods, and then the creation of humanity and the interference and general kind of strange mixture of gods and nymphs and humans that lived in the world of Greek myth. And I wrote it really as a labour of love, just something. It came out of a conversation that I had with some friends. They were talking about creation myths, and so I started talking about how Kronos castrated Uranus, or Uranus, as children love to call him, and then ate all his children with his wife Rhea, and how one of them, Zeus, was saved. And anyway, I was telling the story, and they were all staring at me and going, "How do you know about all this?" I said, "Oh, well, when I was a boy, I just loved reading about Greek myths." And they said, "Well, what about the other gods?" So I told them how Apollo was born, and they said, "You should write this down. It's amazing." I said, "Well, it's got to be written down." And I looked, and I saw that nobody had really retold the stories of Greek myths for years and years and years, and there was really no version of it. You know, there was some sort of comic, graphic novels, if you like, of Hercules and so on, and there'd been TV series about Hercules and sort of big heroes like that, but not really about how the gods came about and how mankind was created and so on. So I did it, and it seemed to go really, really well. And so I followed it up with a story about the heroes, the demigods like Perseus and Hercules and Theseus and Jason and Atalanta and so on. And then one called Troy, about the Trojan War, and I recently finished the Odyssey, which is the coming home of all the Greek heroes, but particularly, of course, Odysseus, who comes home to his home island of Ithaca. And they have proved to be astonishingly popular around the world. Have been translated into 32 languages, and in Greece they're very popular, which has been amazing to me. And also, I seem accidentally, or at least not to have caused it myself, but to have been a part of a wave that I was an early surfer on, in which people became very interested in Greek myths. And after I'd published Mythos, out came a wonderful novel called The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and Pat Barker wrote The Silence of the Women, telling the Trojan War story from the women's point of view, and many others. Bethany Hughes, Natalie Hayes, and Emily Wilson wrote translations of Homer, and now Christopher Nolan is doing a film with Matt Damon as Odysseus of the Odyssey, and Ray Fiennes has recently played Odysseus in a film called The Return by Umberto Pasolini. So there's suddenly been this great interest, and it was like halfway through that I was writing them that I had a kind of realization that maybe what I was doing was escaping the difficulty, and I'm not making some ghastly old person's anti-woke point here at all, but if you set a novel in the present day now, every character, if it's a contemporary novel, has a sort of point of view. They represent something in race, sexuality, gender, history, the history of slavery, the history of empire, all the things that are, rightly, I'm not saying they shouldn't be, but are obsessions of ours. So when you set a book in the 1920s, it's set in the 1920s. Oh, people behaved like that in the Jazz Age. If it's set in the era of Bridgerton and the Regency, then it's about, oh, that's how people were then. Whereas if you set it in the world of myth, that's how people are. Because it's not trapped in the webs of our particular discourse. You can write in myth, you can write about mother-daughter relationships, father-daughter relationships, sibling relationships in pure terms, not bourgeois relationships, not working-class relationships, not relationships predicated on the patriarchy or white privilege or other things that we are rightly very concerned about, but which are contemporary issues.
I see.
Whereas you can write about revenge, hate, hope, joy, love, all the huge issues in myth. And they're about all of us, all the time, because they're timeless. They live in a symbolic age. And I think that's one of the reasons that people have loved not just myth, but also fantasy. You look at the enormous popularity in the last 20 years of obviously the JK Rowling world and the J.R.R. Tolkien world, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, and of course the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of these are sort of outside time in a real sense somehow, so that you don't get caught up too much in the idea of the modern world. And so maybe that's an act of cowardice not to write about the modern world. But it's also it's a liberating thing to write about pure human emotion and relationships without having to think, do I dare say this? Have I the right to say this? Do you know what I mean?
I do. It sounds to me like you're suggesting that we can find a greater human truth in fantasy than necessarily within reality.
I think that is true. That is the point of fiction, generally. Fiction allows you to tell the truth. If you're writing history, then you're caught in the weeds, rather, of fact and accuracy and so on. Whereas if you write about the truth of emotions and relationships of people, then you can do it in something, you take it outside time, I think is the key.
And what is it like to create such an entire world? I mean, you do yourself an injustice. You took all of the Greek myths and wove them into one world, while maintaining their humanity, their truth, their beauty. The way you wrote Achilles is utterly heartbreaking, as of course Achilles always is. But knowing your insight into his one imperfection was just so beautiful. But mythos literally begins with the birth of the gods.
Yes.
And Odyssey, the end. I mean, you literally gave birth to a world and it came to an end. What's it like to close the door on that?
It's very upsetting to leave it now, because it ends with Odysseus really, and with his hearth finally reunited with his wife Penelope, whom he hasn't seen for 20 years, and his son Telemachus, who's 20 years old now and who was a baby when he left Ithaca to go and fight in the Trojan War. And Telemachus is, as it were, tiptoeing out of the scene and leaving the pair of them in front of the hearth. And the gods disappear too. That's the end, really. Now humans care more about themselves and setting up their own world and their own rules, not sacrificing to the gods. And the gods don't come down and breed with and interfere with humans anymore. And it's up, in a sense, what happened then was history. Athens and democracy and logic and reason and all the things that Athens gave us, as well as war and disaster. And we became independent of the gods until Christianity gave us another set of rules to go by. But that was an extraordinary thing, that the Greek myths do have such an arc, such a shape. And to go away from it is worrying. I don't know what to do next, because I love writing and I love being buried in my own world with just a keyboard and a screen to look at. So I don't quite know what I'll do next. Maybe, my publishers want me to consider the world of Arthurian legend and to retell the stories from, Merlin and the birth of Arthur and everything. But let's be honest, Monty Python has made that very difficult. People can say, well, have you come to the knights who say "ni" yet?
Eki Fatang Woodboy, yes.
The holy rabbit and all those things. So,
we're talking about the world of fantasy, and you are, as a gay man, very much associated with Harry Potter and JK Rowling. In this country, trans people are being cancelled.
Yes, shocking.
And I want to be very clear and on record saying that in all the years of our association, never have I ever had a whiff of transphobia. You are without question one of the most generous, kind men that I have the fortune to know.
Well, that's very sweet of you. No, unfortunately,
if I may, what has been very difficult to see as your friend, and indeed as artistic director of this company, that you're patron, and I'm proud to have you, is the world of social media and how it carves you up on both sides. I will have... This is a genuine quote, and I said to you earlier, I'd like this on a T-shirt. I will have one side of the internet saying, and this is an exact quote, Stephen Fry is a roaring arse bandit. And then on the other side, I will have people saying that Stephen Fry is a terrible transphobe and he shouldn't be part of this community.
I don't know where that comes from. I mean, it can only be the fact that I worked with JK Rowling from the very beginning. In 1995, I think it was, my agent called me up and said, there's a children's book. Do you want to do an audio book for it? And I said, well, I've got a few days in a couple of weeks. And I thought, it's a children's book, you know, that's the cat saw the dog and the dog saw the cat and they laughed and the end, you know, it's just a morning's work. But it was a full novel and it was called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and it was the only book she'd ever written, and no one had ever heard of it, and I'd never heard of it, and I read it, and I said to her at the end, jolly good, I really enjoyed it. And she said, well, I've just written a second one. I'm going to write some more of them. And she says, I said to her, good for you. little knowing what would happen. Now, at this point, of course, as far as I know, she had no views on trans issues at all, and had never spoken about it. This is all much more recent, isn't it? And so anyway, I went through reading all the books, and then she started to make these peculiar statements, and clearly had the very strong and difficult views, and she seemed to wake up or kick a hornet's nest of transphobia that has been entirely destructive. And I suppose the only reason people think that I'm transphobic is that I've never come out and spoken against her in the way that other people have. I mean, if I'm asked, I will say I disagree profoundly with her on this subject, and I am very angry, in particular, she doesn't disavow some of the more revolting and truly horrible, I mean, destructive, violently destructive things that people say. She doesn't attack those at all, and she says things that are inflammatory and contemptuous, mocking, and add to a terribly distressing time for trans people that has been, you know, and so she's crowed about the success of some legislation in Scotland and elsewhere, declaring things about gender. And so I'm very happy to go on the record to say that I'm really angry about that. But I don't... my view about all things of the really sharp and difficult nature is that it's much more important to be effective than to be right. And I remember when we were fighting for things like, I mean, even, you know, before the other triumphs and little victories that were achieved by Stonewall and other groups and charities and pressure groups and so on in the gay liberation days, we were making, you know, attempts to get Parliament to equalise the age of consent, for example, because it was 16 for heterosexual consent and 21 for gay male, at least, because lesbians were not counted in law. And they brought it down to 18 as a sort of typical British compromise. And there was the AIDS issue, and there was Section 28 and so on. And I noticed there were two ways of dealing with this. There was the very angry and justifiably angry way, the activist way, that some people, you know, ACT UP and other groups like that went for. And my friend, Derek Jarman, the film director, was furious. But then there was the way that Ian McKellen did it, which was to go and see John Major. He went to Number 10 to try and persuade John Major to do it. And he did persuade John Major slightly, but his view was that in order to get anything done in Britain, it would be too slow. It would be very annoying, but that you don't alienate the establishment. You stop them being afraid of you. You stop them fearing you. You stop them thinking you're a hysteric and that you're a person they can do business with. And it seems hypocritical and it seems tedious. It seems to people who are angry and at the barricades. And my view is you need both. You need Derek, and Derek Jarman never forgave Ian for this. You know, he said to him, "How dare you go and visit a Tory prime minister, you know, and go in, as it were, into bed with these people." And Ian's view, and I think Ian was right, was that you get them on your side. You show them that you're not these, you know, you're not child molesting maniacs. You're decent people who are just looking for justice and honour and respect. And it was a conservative government, a terrible one, that allowed me to marry the man I love. It happened to be David Cameron who pushed it through in the teeth of much animosity at the grassroots level of the Tory party, certainly. But and there were those who will shout and scream, and I understand the shouting and screaming, but to me it's more important to be effective than to be right. And I think one of the huge problems in our world is that people would rather be right and say this is what's true than actually achieve something. And achieving something does involve those awful words, slow compromise and, bit by bit, and not an instant revolution, not an instant transformation. And so that's how my experience of many things, causes, like, the AIDS cause with with the Terence Higgins Trust that I worked with for 20 years. I was in charge of their fundraising arm, their friends. And there were some people, again, who were so angry about the government, and they were right to be. But I would go and have dinner with Conservative MPs and say to them, this, you do see, and Norman Fowler, who was a health minister at the time, is now in the House of Lords. He has been one of the greatest allies of gay people with HIV, because he learnt. And if you can get these people on your side who may be against you, but if you scream in their face and tell them they are hate, then they will just go, I can't live with these people, I'm sorry. And, yes, it's a compromise. And yes, it would be great if you just screamed the truth and everybody bowed down and listened. But in the real world, if you want something done rather than wanting to be right, then you have to make these things. So, when it comes to the transphobia issue, yes, I mean, it is right to remind people that trans people are here and that they are hurting and that they're being abominably treated, and that the recent sort of way the culture has gone against them has meant there is a great deal of bullying and violence and suicide and genuine pain and agony in the trans community. But to scream transphobe at anybody who doesn't buy into every single aspect of that particular person's trans views is so self-harming. It doesn't get the thing done. You have to sort of let people love you, and maybe I'm wrong, but what I'm not is transphobic, I promise you. And it seems to me that if you can just get people to look into the eyes of each other, and see the humanity on both sides, for trans people to see that you're wrong to be afraid of me. I'm not here to go into women's lavatories and rape people and this, mad kind of a narrative that is being pursued. Don't be afraid of me. I'm living the life as I see that I'm born to live and know that I must live. And you should know that it is a decent thing and that you should understand it. And I'm not, but if you just scream, "You're full of hate" at someone, then they will just go, "Well, fuck you." And nothing gets done. So I'm aware that there's no kind of purity of, revolutionary in me, but that's kind of what I've come to feel over the years, if that makes sense.
It makes huge sense, and I'm glad when people point fingers and go transphobe, I can point to this moment, because what I will ask is, I wonder how active JK Rowling is is actually within your life. I mean...
No, I mean, she used to be... I mean, I used to see her occasionally. If I was in Edinburgh, we would have dinner together. The last time was 6-7 years ago.
Right.
And we, you know... I know that she thinks she's good, and I'd love just, you know, as so many people I know would. I mean, I've done quite a lot of things with a group of intersex people, which is a branch, the I in LGBTQI, if you use those letters, and they're a very overlooked group of people. And Emma Thompson and I got Emma Thompson on board to executive produce a film called Pony Boy, and I was talking to the producer and to various other people involved in that world, and they were all saying, you know, JK Rowling, can you arrange for us to have a meeting? We just want to talk to her. And I so felt for them, because that's what. But I know she's deaf to our entreaties. That she's got her own. She's been radicalised, I fear, and it may be that she's been radicalised by turfs, or whatever you call it, on her own end, but also by the vitriol that is thrown at her, which is unhelpful and only hardens her. And will only continue to harden her, I'm afraid. And I'm not saying that she shouldn't be called out when she says things that are really cruel and wrong and mocking. But yeah, she, you know, unfortunately, I think she seems to be a lost cause for us. And I'm sorry, because I always liked her company. I found her charming and funny and interesting. And then this thing happened, and it just completely altered the way she talks and engages with the world now. It's strange.
Thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now for something completely different. You were the host of QI. Seamless. You were the host of QI from 2003 to 2015. Yeah. What was the fact that still haunts you to this day?
I wish I could remember them better. They streamed into my head on the day of recording. I mean, I loved, you know, I loved it with, you know, things that go against what you imagine. So when I'm with Americans, I always give them a couple of facts that astonish them. And they're not insulting facts to America. They're the sort of the reverse. I'll say, you know, Tower Bridge. And they'll go, which one is that? Is that London Bridge? And you'll say, no, well, the Tower Bridge is the one with the towers and it swings open and closed like that. And they go, yeah. I'll go, Tower Bridge is more modern than Brooklyn Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge was finished before Tower Bridge. They'll go, get the fuck out of here. and they sort of don't want to hear it, because they think, but London is old. And they say, yeah. And I say, you know, Harvard University, when Harvard University was founded, Galileo was still alive. They'll go, wow. No, that's not possible. I mean, oh, thank you. Oh, the kind man's brought some water. My water boy.
Hasn't been called that for a while, Jimmy Smith.
I mean, you know, and obviously one loves all the things about you know, one of the most important jobs you could have as a young man trying to get on in the world of Tudor, you know, politics and the court was you would vie for the job of being the person who wiped Henry VIII's arse. It was called being groom of the stool. And it was the Earl of this and the Duke of that would push forward. They say, my son is, please, can he wipe your ass? The king would say, well, I need a new groom of the stool. So yes, we'll try him. And the king would seat himself on a privy, and the groom of the stool would be behind with straw, and he'd pull the straw back. But it gave him a chance to speak to the king. At his most vulnerable and private.
So what you're suggesting is I need to become JK Rowling's groom of the stool.
Exactly.
I'm not doing it. I want to go back to 1997 and the film that I mentioned earlier. It's such an important film in my development as a gay man. You played Oscar Wilde. Indeed, I'm not the first to say that you were born to be Wilde. And you have had a love affair with this extraordinary Irish poet, playwright, essayist your whole life. How on earth does one prepare to play an historic character like that when you know the size of his shadow?
Yes. It's an interesting point. And when I was offered the part, similar in a smaller way, when Hugh and I were offered the parts of Jeeves and Wooster, we thought, we can't do this. These are immortal literary characters. And then, as we were walking away from the meeting with the producers saying we would think this over, and we were very honoured, and we were going, we can't do this. We'd screw it up. We would. And then one of us, probably Hugh, said, but can we let someone else screw it up? We thought, no, we're not going to let other people screw it up. If someone's going to screw it up, it'll be us. And similarly, when they said, would you play Oscar Wilde, I thought, oh no, I'll get it wrong. He's such a holy figure in my pantheon, and how could I approach him? And it would be but then I suddenly thought, well, then I'll only offer it to someone else, and I would feel. And then I remembered the sort of general truth in life that the only real failure is not to try. And so I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I'd known about Wilde and collected his works, and had a few signed photographs of him that I'd bought in the days when they were more or less affordable. I have a beautiful one that he wrote, which just his signature is "The Secret of Life is in Art," Oscar Wilde, and I look at that from time to time. So yeah, I can. I just thought, well, it's a film. And with films, you have to believe that the vertical moments that is your business every day, you're doing a slice of the film, a little vertical moment, which is like an analogue of how film in the film days worked. It was a single frame plus another single frame plus another single frame, and you run them together and you get action. Similarly, you do a single moment in the camera, and then another single moment, and then another single moment, and then in the magic of editing, a story emerges, and you hope it works. But that what you can't do is say, I have to understand Oscar, I have to be Oscar. I remember someone saying when I was I saw them one evening after a day's work at Shepperton, where we'd been filming. And in the morning, we had done this scene where he goes down a mine. It's opening of the film. He's on his tour of America as a young man. Before he's really particularly famous for having written anything, he's more famous for his style, his wit, and the way he dressed and the way he spoke. And he'd been asked to go on a tour of America, and he was in Colorado, in Leadville, and he went down to a silver mine, and he lectured the miners on Benvenuto Cellini, the Renaissance silversmith, and on a subject that he called the House Beautiful. It's reckoned to be the first time anybody spoke about interior decoration. Anyway, we did that scene in the morning, and there was Wilde. He was the most promising young man of his generation. He was famous just for his style, for his wit, for having won so many prizes at Trinity College Dublin and then at Oxford, and he was destined for a brilliant career. Most people thought he would go into Parliament, perhaps. He would marry, everything would be just glorious because he was so brilliant. And so then, in the afternoon, we did a scene where Wilde is on a treadmill in prison, where he was sent to prison for 2 years, hard labour. And he was the most hated and despised man of his generation. The scandal was colossal. His name was unspeakable. He changed the way men behaved together in public. At the moment the Oscar Wilde trial happened, men stopped holding hands. They used to, as they do still in Arabic countries, in Greece, around the Mediterranean, in Mexico. Men hold hands if they're friends, just as women do. And it's a normal thing to do. Men used to. Hussars and soldiers in Hyde Park would hold hands. The moment the Wilde trial happened, men no longer, they could barely shake hands. They would never touch each other. Everything changed about being a male. It altered everything, the fear, the repulsion, the extraordinary nature of the trial. There had been nothing seen or heard like it. The evidence given at the trial shocked people beyond imagining. So his reputation was absolutely at the lowest, and he was so ill he was probably going to die in prison. And there he is on a treadmill, this appalling punishment that didn't drive a washing mangle or do anything. It was purely punishment. You just stood on a treadmill and trod until you were exhausted, and people would fall off it, and children would be on it. I mean, it was absolutely appalling. So the person said, do you take Oscar Wilde with you, to bed? Well, which Oscar would I take? The one who's the most promising young man, or the one who is crushed and killed? You do the same in one day. So you have to separate that, you know, as I say, go into these... we had the great fortune of having Merlin Holland on set, who was Oscar's grandson. Oscar died in 1900, but his two sons, who were Cyril and Vivian... Cyril, the older one, was old enough to understand the scandal of his father, and it kind of screwed him up. And the moment the First World War happened, 14 years after Oscar's death, he threw himself at the trenches and died in the first week of the war. He was determined to prove himself a man, you know, because he was the son of Oscar Wilde. But his second son, Vivian, lived a long, long life as a man of letters and married twice. And his second marriage was very late. He was quite an old man, and he had a son. And that son was Merlin. And Merlin Holland... it was around the film set. So it was weird to be making it. It was sort of roundabout. We were getting towards exactly 100 years after the trial, because the film was made in 1994-5, and 1895 was the trial of Oscar Wilde when he went to prison. So to have this man, and to have his DNA next to me was a very extraordinary thing. But I'll tell you what it is about Oscar. We think of him as a gay hero, icon. We think of him as an Irish hero and icon. We think of him as the icon of art and literature and a way of life. And he is all those things. When I first started to become a little well-known, I get invited to talk at colleges and universities. And at the very beginning, you would go to, they'd invite you to their rooms to, have a glass of wine or whatever and chat. And you would see posters on the wall. And the posters would usually be, Jimi Hendrix and Karl Marx or John Lennon, say, the washed-out, bleached photograph from Imagine. And because students felt if the world was going to be saved, it would be saved by rock and roll music and revolution. But gradually, you noticed that those posters were no longer on the walls, and it would be Oscar and Albert Einstein. Because if the world was going to be saved, it would be the life of the mind. And it would either be the beauty of science, or it would be the beauty of poetry. And, the fact this man stood for the eternal student, the Prince of Bohemia, the idea that you never close your mind, you're always a student, you're always questioning, the dynamic life, he called it. Those who know what they want to be, a judge, a grocer, a soldier, they will become it. As he said, that is their punishment. But those who don't know what they want to be, every day is a different adventure. That is their reward. And you eat the fruit of every tree, of every orchard in the world, and some are bitter, and some are addictive, some are make you sick, and some are so wonderful you don't want to try any others, but you try as many as they are because it's your only life. You make adventures with your soul and your spirit. And he died in the most terrible disgrace of any human being, really, of his age. But I always think of this image of New York City when I first went there. If you've ever gone down Fifth Avenue, if you go at sort of 2 or 3 in the morning, down from Central Park all the way down to the Village, as they call it, you'll pass 33rd and 34th Street. And if you're in a cab, the cab driver will say to you, if he knows you, it's your first visit, and that's the Empire State Building, you want to have a look at that. And you look out and you can just see the base of it, and the cab moves away, and you try and look up out of the rear window. But there are buildings that are nearer to you as you go, and they obscure it. You can't see how tall it is. But New York being New York, if the green lights are synchronized and it's 2 or 3 in the morning, you get a clear run down. And as you go further and further down, you have this wonderful illusion that all the small buildings fall away, and it rises up and up and up and up and up, and like a rocket as you look. And the buildings that were in the way when you were close are now but down there, and it is up there. And as the decades passed after Oscar's death, that's what happened. He was nothing. You couldn't say his name. And then all these other writers who were nothing next to him seemed to obscure him. But as the decades passed, his reputation grew and grew and grew and grew. And then the most wonderful thing happened that caused me to burst into absolute tears when I heard about it, was about 15 years ago, the Irish government, with the French authority in charge of the particular arrondissement in Paris, where his grave is, in the Père Lachaise cemetery, and there's a sarcophagus by Jacob Epstein, called the Sphinx, made of sandstone. And it was rotting, falling away, eroding, and it was eroding because so many thousands of visitors had kissed it, and the acid from the lipstick and the kissing had caused the sandstone to erode. A man who died believing his name was mud and nothing and could never be resurrected had become a point of pilgrimage for thousands of people around the world for whom he was their Oscar, for whom he said something. And that to me was the most extraordinary vindication of any figure I could think of.
I remember studying philosophy and kissing it myself with purple lipstick was the trend back
so
then.
So
when I
you
was
were one
younger.
of the people who
It's my fault. It's always my fault. And I can't talk about Oscar Wilde without talking about P.G. Wodehouse. Again, two writers with two extraordinary similar and different styles. One with such joy, one with such heartache.
Yes.
It's almost like your own bipolarity in some respect, Wilde to Wodehouse. Yeah. Would that be fair to say?
Well, it kind of is, yes. I mean, they both have the similarity that they are lords of language. Wodehouse's language is extraordinary. He was called in his own day the greatest writer of English prose alive. And some people who only think of Wodehouse as being like silly asses in monocles going, I say, don't understand that if you read the books, you enter a world of prose that is beyond delicious. It's like, someone said, it's like diving into a souffle. I mean, it is just the most extraordinarily rewarding experience. And it is pure sunlight. Even Moore described it as Eden before the fall. There are beds, but the beds are for hiding under. There's no sex in them. There's no, I mean, he wrote from 1900 to 1975 when he died, exactly 50 years ago. And in that period, there were the two massive world wars and, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Holocaust, all kinds of things. They're never mentioned in all his works. And you may think that that's a kind of weird evasion, but it's this world of sunlight in which, it is such a wonderful thing to escape into. And he wrote himself that at first he said, I was rather distressed to read that amongst my most loyal readers are prisoners and people in hospitals. I thought, the sick and the criminal like me. And then I realized there was no greater compliment that a writer could receive, that you gave joy to the sick and to the criminal, people in prisons. Because we're all sick and we're all in prisons most of our lives in one way or another. And Wodehouse is a release from that. It's a joyous release.
It's such a beautiful insight into your mind, describing it that way. As someone who went to prison as well.
Yes, indeed.
When did you discover Wodehouse?
I was given a book called Very, Very Good Jeeves, which is a collection of short stories by a godmother when I was 10. And I then just tore through them. And again, fortunate for my age, I could buy copies, second-hand books in bookshops, which then turned out to be first editions, which I now have an enormous collection of rather valuable first editions because people collect them now. But they're more valuable to me just as memories of buying them. And I wrote to him when I was about 14. I read an interview he gave in Punch magazine, I think it was, and it revealed that it was near a little village, hamlet or a burg, as they call it in America, on Long Island called Remsenburg, and. So he said, that he liked to walk every morning to the post office in Remsenburg to pick up his mail and walk back, and that was his morning walk of about 6 miles. And then he would start work. He was 90 at the time, and so I thought I'll write him, and I wrote to P.G. Wodehouse, care of the post office, Remsenburg, Long Island, New York, and I said, my name is Stephen Fry, and and I really like your books, and I talked about, the things I liked and so on. And he wrote back. He said three pages, all typed on his very famous typewriter, which is like the ship of Theseus, the philosophical idea of the ship of Theseus, which is in Athens. And Theseus, the great hero, had sailed this ship to Crete and back. And but over the years, they'd replaced the sails, and then they replaced the rigging, and then they replaced the planks, and they replaced the hull, and they replaced the keel over the years. Was it the same ship? It's a sort of ontological question, and you would say the same of P.G. Wodehouse's typewriter. He bought this Royal typewriter in 1901, and he had it in 75, but it was a new platen, it was new keys, they'd replaced the chassis and the roller and all the other different bits, but it was somehow still the same typewriter. And he wrote to me on this letter and telling me about how he wasn't walking to the post office because my pins have gone back on me. His legs weren't working very well. And he told me how he watched the Mets playing baseball now instead of cricket because he couldn't get cricket in New York. And he included a photograph to Stephen Fry, all the best, B.G. Wodehouse, which I still have, of course, and I had it in my trailer when we were shooting the Jeeves and Wooster series, and every morning I would go in and give it a little kiss before I got into my Jeeves costume.
Utterly wonderful. Yeah. You have such a distinctive voice. How do you approach voice work? And why do you think so many people like to use your voice for their products, books, documentaries?
Well, I mean, you know, in this strange way, it's part of the snobbery of England that my voice, for good or ill, makes it sound as if my larynx is made of tweed.
Isn't it?
It's a kind of old-fashioned voice. It is born of the fact that as an insomniac as a child, when I wasn't reading, I was listening to the World Service in Radio 4 and hearing those continuity announcers doing the shipping forecast and everything else, and radio plays with, you know, old school actors. And Vivian Stanshall, who was the sort of lead figure in the Bonzo Dog Band, who had the most beautiful voice of anyone I ever heard. And my favourite actors, amongst my favourite actors, were Robert Donat and Ronald Colman, and the English actors of the golden age of Hollywood, David Niven a little later, but those sorts of actors, and their sort of fantastic way of speaking, and the articulacy and the beauty of it, and the unrolling of words. I mean, merely the sound of the tip of the tongue hitting the back of the teeth is a very beautiful thing. The actual texture of a voice can be lovely, and it's not just a voice that happens to be my accent and to reek of my world. I'm going to read one of my favourite poems now. It's very short.
Please do.
It's by a man I love as a poet, though I'm not really that fond of him as a novelist, which is odd because that's what he's better known as, and that's D.H. Lawrence. But he did write wonderful poetry, I think, and this is a short poem. It's called The Oxford Voice. The Oxford Voice. When you hear it languishing and hooing and cooing and sidling through the front teeth, the Oxford voice, or worse still, the would-be Oxford voice, you don't even laugh anymore. You can't, for every blooming bird is an Oxford cuckoo nowadays. You can't sit on a bus, nor in the tube, but it breathes gently and languishingly in the back of your neck. And oh, so seductively superior, so seductively, self-effacingly, deprecatingly superior. We wouldn't insist on it for a moment, but we are. We are. You admit we are superior. Isn't that fabulous?
Quite right.
Lovely. There's another one.
It's very different to the Sainsbury's advert. It's very, very different.
Good food for all of us.
Jake, we need to invoice Sainsbury's.
I just love being in a glass box with a microphone, not having to wear makeup or get into costume, just either reading an audiobook or doing, actually I did for 3 hours this morning. I was doing a new natural history documentary, a narration about some of the wildlife of China. And it's fascinating. Look at the pictures, Siberian tigers and pikas and Tibetan foxes and all these amazing animals. And just, enjoying the pleasure of doing something like that, which is maybe won't last. It was a year before the ChatGPT large language model came out that someone sent me a piece of film in which I'd narrated it was a documentary about the German occupation of the Netherlands in the Second World War, full of German names like Seyss-Inquart, who was the governor there, and various Dutch names, Geert van der Weyden and people like that. And I was thinking, I don't remember doing this. And then it said in the email, you won't remember doing this because you didn't do it. This is done by our AI system. Terrifying. And they thought I'd be thrilled because what they were sort of offering was, now you don't have to go to the studio to read it. This AI voice can read a whole novel for you in a second. And you'll get the money because we will license it. And I thought, no, this isn't right. So I sent it to my agent, and both here and in America, and they freaked out completely. And it was around the same time they began to be knowing about it, and the Writers Guild of America and the SAG-AFTRA, which is the Screen Actors Guild, and the Association of Film and Television Actors and Radio Actors. They went on strike, you may remember, around that time. And one of the bones of contention was this issue of whether or not... Now, part of me thinks, do you know what? If they had my voice, and this particular group had got my voice, the data set they used was all the Harry Potter books. And the reason they did it as a German occupation of the Netherlands was to show that it wasn't just words that were in Harry Potter, it was my voice that they had, and it could do German and it could do Dutch just as well as it could do anything else. And I thought, well, if someone said, we'll pay you X if you will do a prospectus for our share offering for our company and it's 300 pages, I would think, I'll never do that. But if the AI wants to do it for me, then I thought, no, Stephen, no, that's that's wrong.
But they wouldn't have you.
No, it wouldn't be me. It wouldn't be me, but it would be my voice, and it's a strange thought. Or my face, or my singing, if it's Elton or whoever else it is. And as you know, this has been a huge bone of contention, not just imitating the person and passing off as that person, which is one thing, but scraping all the material. I know that all my books, everything I've written, has been scraped by AI, because you can check if you're a writer.
Without you being given a penny.
Oh, yes. And that you can't get that toothpaste back in the tube. That's a done thing. And whether, I suppose what would be annoying was if someone then got that as a data set and then sold a book on Amazon as if by me because it was in my voice, in the sense of a writer's voice. And all these things. But, all these things, of course, as writers and artists, we fight our corner. But I don't think it's writers and artists who are most threatened by AI. I think it's the human race, for one thing. I've been interested in AI since the 1980s, which was in the middle of what was known as the AI winter. Right. And I was lucky enough to meet a man called Marvin Minsky. And Marvin Minsky is known as the father of AI. He coined the phrase artificial intelligence. It didn't exist before he made it up. It was a way of explaining what Alan Turing had formulated in a paper about the ability of machines possibly one day to think. And Alan Turing, who's, I'm sure you know, and Benedict Cumberbatch played him in The Imitation Game and so on. But anyway... Marvin Minsky ran and founded the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT in Boston, and he was a very interesting man. But there was no, as I say, it was called the AI winter because there was nothing was happening. All these ideas were coming out, these intellectual ideas, these philosophical ideas, these neurological ideas about what AI might be, but nothing was happening. And the reason wasn't because they weren't clever enough to think of how to make AI in those days. They were, and they did. They caused the foundation of it. It's as if Carl Benz in Mannheim had invented the internal combustion engine, not in 1895 as he did, but in 1845. There would have been his internal combustion engine. But in 1845, no one had cracked crude oil into its constituent rainbow of parts, including gasoline and kerosene and butane and all the other hydrocarbons. And so he would have had an engine that couldn't run because there was no fuel for it.
I see.
And that's what AI was like. There was no fuel. The fuel for AI is data. And data didn't exist in 1980 unless you typed it in. If you wanted it to know the works of Shakespeare, you literally typed it in to a medium, a Winchester drive, a drum, a disc, such as they were in those days. But now, there's all the data, the total sum of human knowledge is there. and all you need is for it to crawl through it and have it as its basis for then the mathematics, the back propagation and the stochastic, the Bayesian logic and all the other things that make up these large language models and the LRMs, the large reasoning models that they're making claims for and so on. Now there's a metric in the AI world called P-doom, the letter P, brackets, doom, close brackets. And I rather like it because it sounds like a heartbeat. Ba-doom, ba-doom, ba-doom.
Or Kylie Minogue.
And yeah, exactly, padam, padam. And I want her, I'm actually going to work on her to re-record padam, padam as padoom, padoom.
I love that you're our patron.
Yeah, because
that's queer theatre.
Because what padoom is P is probability expressed as a percentage, and doom is the extinction of the human race. So if you set P at 20%, you think there's a 20% chance that AI will destroy us. It doesn't say when, that's a different metric. So what I've done is look to see what most of the really important people in the field have set P-doom to be. And it goes from 0%, Yann LeCun. Yann LeCun is one of the so-called godfathers of current AI, deep learning and reinforcement learning and so on, unsupervised machine learning. But he is the chief AI officer at Meta, who are, of course, Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. And that's a bit like a tobacco executive saying, there's no chance you will get cancer at all. But if you go to another end, you go to the founder of MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, who's a fellow called Eliezer Yudkowsky. He sets it at 90% chance of human catastrophe. And this is all to do with what's known as the alignment problem. It's the fact that you can't predict how an AI is going to solve a problem you give it. At the most extreme, you may remember if you read philosophy, there's a thought experiment called the genie problem. And the genie problem is a very simple one. You've got a genie, it gives you a wish. And you love humanity and you hate suffering. So you say to the genie, if you really can grant everything, and say, absolutely, this is the genie master, your wish is my command. Say, well then, can you end all suffering on earth? Of course. All life is extinguished instantly because it has answered the question exactly. If it looked at the world, where is suffering? Oh, suffering is in life. Plants suffer, animals suffer, all humans suffer. Stones don't suffer. Rivers don't suffer. So if I get rid of all life, there will be no suffering. I have answered the question. Now, that's an alignment problem because the genie wasn't thinking like a human. And AIs don't think like humans. Well, they don't think, but their processes are not human. So you constantly are setting it problems, and it sets itself sub-goals to solve those problems. And you don't see what they are. One of the most frightening things about AI is nobody knows how it works. They know how to set it up, but they don't know what's going on once they set it off. They don't know what it's doing. And at the moment, it's fine, but it is a serious problem as each iteration, because the people who are in charge of it are not governments, as it was with nuclear power, when there were atomic energy commissions and there were guidelines and guardrails, and even at the height of the Cold War, people were talking to each other and controlling the use of nuclear power and nuclear, fissile materials. But now, the same people who are in charge of AI are the fuckers who gave us Facebook.
Yeah.
And we know how much they care about human happiness and human success and responsibility and decency. They don't care at all. They've been shown and they've known how much harm they're doing and have done to the political structure and the cultural and spiritual world that we inhabit, and now they're the only ones. And any interference, any guardrails, any regulations, they scream, oh, communism, So if you take a medium of how P-doom is set, you might say about 7.5%. Oh, that's reasonable. There's only a 7.5%. Well, if you buy a lottery ticket in this country, there is a 0.0000022% chance of your winning the jackpot in the lottery, which is obviously very small. But we do it because the reward is so big. And if the opposite of a reward is a punishment, the punishment is, and that's 7.5%. So if I was to, and that 7.5 is 3.4 million times greater than 0.0000022. So if I were to give you a lottery ticket and say this is a valid lottery ticket, but you are 3.4 million times more likely to win with this ticket than with an ordinary ticket, you would take it.
Of course.
And that's the chances we're talking about. 3.4 million times more likely than winning the lottery.
Terrifying.
So something needs to be done. It's really what I'm saying. And Pidoom is, I'm hoping to make a film called Pidoom, and that's why I'd like Kylie to re-record Padam, because I think people should know this. I think people should at least have the understanding of it, and not necessarily. There are people to listen to: Stuart Russell, Geoffrey Hinton, Demis Hassabis, and people like that. Demis Hassabis and Geoffrey Hinton won the Nobel Prize last year, and the reason is that they were responsible for the real breakthroughs that made, but it wasn't in physics or that they got the Nobel Prize. It was in chemistry, because it was to do with benefiting the human race. They founded a company called AlphaFold, which is about understanding the structure of proteins, which has always been one of the most baffling and difficult problems that humanity has ever faced. And no one ever believed that classical computing could solve the structure of proteins. And there are now 2 million scientists currently working on instances of AlphaFold, which has been given free to them. And they will end Alzheimer's. They will. There's no question. It's a protein problem, as you probably know, and amyloid plaque, and Huntington's and various other terrible conditions that kill us, and in many cancers too, will be solved by things like this. So it's not all bad, but it requires people better than Zuckerfucking-Bird to be running these things, or Musk, to have them as the ones who are deciding where it's going and who are constantly releasing it without supervision, without concern, and let alone the automated warfare and the other problems, and the criminals being allowed basically access to it.
Can I ask, you were wrongly criticised again for giving your likeness over to AI, and it's such a delicious story, and I'd love you to share it.
Yes, this is a company called Vocalize, and it was my vocal likeness, and it was not a trap. It was a game, really. We had a booth at the Hay-on-Wye Literary Festival, actually, and people passed it, and they were looking at it, and a lot of them came up to me afterwards and said, I don't believe you've involved yourself in this. This is wrong. And what it was it's saying, come into the Vocalize tent and speak for 3 minutes, answer a sort of questionnaire on screen with your voice, and we will take your voice and you can use your voice now for voiceovers and narrations and audiobooks and anything you like, and the AI will do it for you, and you will have your voice now as a reader of audiobooks, children's books, whichever you want, or advertisements and things like that. And my face and voice was telling them how to do it. Answer these questions, say these words as if it's a children's story, say these words as if it's a seductive advertisement, say these words as if you're reading instructions. So you have about 3 jobs. And then a few seconds later, they are shown 3 films with their voice doing the narration. But they are justifications of Nazism. They are awful films, and they are grotesque, the things they're saying. And the point of it is to warn them that this is what's possible with taking someone's voice and likeness, is that they can be made to say things that they are not responsible for. So, but people saw that I was doing this and thought that I was prostituting myself to make money out of saying, give me your voice and we will, and I was encouraging them to do that, but actually it was the opposite.
Oh.
Yeah.
I want to finish on this question before I do some quick fire questions. But of all of your works, whether that be literary, performing, what is the one that you most enjoy?
Oh my goodness, it is difficult because, there's no question the first time you write a book, a full book, a novel, you can't quite believe you've done it. And when it comes back from the publisher, there's a box of them, and you open and you smell them and you weigh them and you look at it and you see the copyright page, and you just cannot believe that is, it's in a very small way as a mother must feel when a baby emerges from inside them. It's just this amazing feeling, and it almost doesn't matter whether the book's going to work or succeed or anyone's going to read it, but it's there and you've made it, and it's a wonderful feeling, especially if, like me, you grew up thinking of books as almost holy objects, and therefore things that other people did, and the idea that you might do one day. So there's no question that my first novel was called The Liar. It was a novel, and just seeing it, I can still see it on the table in the particular little house I was in Islington at the time, and just walking around it and turning my back on it and then pouncing on it as if to catch it unawares, So that is a moment, as the poet Browning put it, you can never hope to recapture that first fine careless rapture. And that was a first fine careless rapture.
It's a wonderful book. I adore it.
Thank you so much.
We're nearly at the end of the show, but I have the original show used to do a thing called Funny 5 Minutes, but I was very young and enthusiastic and liked lots of music to play. But actually, I just like some quick fire questions now as I get older. What's your favourite play?
The Importance of Being Earnest.
Worst audition?
Let me. Do you know? I've only ever really done one. It's actually quite a good story. I will just sort of stretch it out now. But one of my heroes when I was growing up was Alan Bennett, and I had a sort of record of his, in Beyond the Fringe and all of the sketches he did and so on. And there was a cassette of his first play, 40 Years On. And in 1983, my agent called me up. I'd only just been a year and a half out of university, and she said, "Can you go for an audition for Alan Bennett's 40 Years On? They're going to do it at Chichester." And I thought, wow, I could be in. And it was for the part that Alan Bennett played. And it was at the Garrick Theatre in London. And I went to the Garrick, and there was the director, Patrick Garland, and the producer, John Gale. But next to him, Alan Bennett was actually there. And I was so afraid, I just kind of froze. And I could barely, I read the bits that I was supposed to read and then ran away. And my agent called me up in the evening, and I said, I was just awful. I was so nervous. Alan Bennett was there. It completely freaked me out. And then the next day, she called up and said, "You've got a recall." And I didn't know what a recall was. I said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It's something awful. Am I being fired or what? from your office?" I thought she no longer want me to be an agent, be her agent. She said, "No, it means they want to hear you again." I said, "Really? After I was so bad, honestly." They said, "No, they'd quite like to hear you again." So I went back to the Garrick Theatre that afternoon, and it was just Patrick, the director, and John Gale, the producer. I thought, oh, thank God. So I read the part and thing like that. And they looked down, they sort of looked down. I didn't know why they were looking down, but they looked down. And then they got up and said, "Well, we think we'd like to offer you the part of the Tempest for this production." I said, "Oh, thank goodness." And then Alan Bennett got up. He'd been hiding under the thing because he'd heard I was nervous. He said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're doing it. Thank you." It was the sweetest thing. He really was. So that was my worst and best audition.
West End or Broadway?
Oh, I think the West End for me, definitely. Absolutely and completely. I mean, I enjoyed playing Broadway. I did the 12th Night there, and I enjoyed it when I had my musical, Me and My Girl, running there for 4 or 5 years. It was fantastic. I wasn't in it, but I'd written the book for Me and My Girl, and Robert Lindsay played it at first, and it was there for 4 or 5 years, as I say, and it was so wonderful going to revisit it. I went once, and I was sitting in... I used to sit in Robert's dressing room, Robert Lindsay, when he was doing it in the first 2 years he did it. And one time I went to his dressing room, and there was someone sitting on the sofa, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he turned around, I said, "No, it's fine, don't worry." It was Michael Jackson. and Robert Lindsay came in and went, "Oh, why does Stephen give me a hug?" And, "Oh, hi, Michael." I thought, bloody hell. And then eventually Michael went away, and Robert said, "It's rather strange, but Michael's been to see it about 6 times, and he thinks he wants to take over from me in the role." I said, "Wow." So that was pretty amazing. So Broadway has that kind of side to it, and it was wonderful, as I say, doing 12th Night there, because it was a hit. Mark Rylance was the star of it, and I was playing Malvolio, and really enjoyed myself. And on Broadway, the thing is, the other actors do come and see you afterwards. In Britain, we're all a bit nervous about going round, as the phrase is, because we think, what right do we have to go round? Why should I go and knock on this actor's door after I've seen them? They might go, "What are you doing here?" Unless they're a very good friend. But on Broadway, it's Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington, and they all come round and say, "Hi!" And you go, "Hi!"
How infuriating.
Yeah, I know, it's just amazing.
And just to finish before we wind the show up, what's Claudia Winkleman's Fringe like in person? Can you release that outside of the NDA?
I'm amazed it doesn't make her eyes bleed. Well,
there's the clip for the episode.
She's adorable. Obviously, I can't say a word about the fact that I was in this recently recorded celebrity version, I suppose you have to call it, of the Traitors.
And you were a traitor, right?
I'm certainly not telling you whether I was a traitor or a faithful, but I was one or the other. And it was a great, fascinating group of people. There was Jonathan Ross and Tom Daly and Paloma Faith. And it was an extraordinary bunch, actually, and we all got on terribly well. Until the game started to bite, and there's something about the structure of that game. I mean, that's why I agreed to do it. I'm not trying to make I'm not being all grand or anything, but I didn't think I would usually, I have said no to any number of, Strictlys and Get Me Out of Here's and all the rest of it, because it's just not my kind of thing. But this, I watched the series, the first and then the second series, and I just thought it's such a clever game. It's so extraordinary what it does to the psychology of the individual. And I just thought it would be really interesting to play it. And what an opportunity to do so. And that's what I found. It was a bit like, I was saying to you earlier, something else we were talking about. It was a bit like a Chinese foot massage. Have you ever had one of those? It's absolute agony, but it's sort of, I want to do it again, please. It's that sort of an experience. It's kind of emotionally violent, but you kind of love it.
Well, spending time with you has not been absolute agony. It's been an absolute joy. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Sir Stephen Fry.
Thank you very much.
I'm afraid that's the end of the show. For those tuning in from home, backstage, or perhaps even in the bath, make sure you're subscribed to the Show People podcast to be notified as soon as the next episode drops. We'd like to extend our gratitude to our fantastic sponsors, Theatre Counts, the entertainment industry's trusted accountants, looking after thousands of clients across theatre and performance. Connect with them at theatrecounts.co.uk or at Theatre Counts on social media. Thank you to Jake Waby Productions, London's experts in theatre and live performance videography, capturing your stories just the way you want them. From West End shows to global content, their experienced team delivers exceptional cinematic storytelling. And a huge thank you to the Two Brewers, the finest LGBTQ+ venue in London, Jimmy Smith, Rhys Godfrey, Adam Deemer, and all their glorious staff. This podcast is proudly produced by Queer Theatre, committed to telling LGBTQ+ stories and nurturing queer talent. If you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to support our work, including you audience, please consider making a donation at queertheatre.co.uk, where you'll also discover details about our weekly acting classes for queer people, the Queer Play Reading Club, and showcases, networking events, parties, and masterclasses. If you're queer, come and be a part of our community. They're brilliant. If not, come and be an ally and support our shows and the work we do, like coming to see the Show People podcast, which will be back next month. Finally and lastly, please put your hands together again for my wonderful friend and our guest, Sir Stephen Fry. Until next time, love always.